Imagine a world where the United States failed in its first bid to become a global empire, where the dreams of manifest destiny hit a wall not on the Great Plains, but in the jungles of Cuba and the harbors of the Philippines, where a declining European monarchy crushed an upstart republic, preserving its hold on a dying empire. It sounds impossible, but history often hinges on razor-thin margins. Today, we're going to dive deep into a timeline where the United States lost the Spanish-American War. Stick around, because this isn't just about a few battles gone wrong. This alternate past spirals into a very different 20th century, one filled with imperial echoes, fractured democracies, and a far darker global order. The Spanish-American War of 1898 is often remembered as a swift, almost triumphant war for the United States. Sparked by the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor and fueled by yellow journalism, the war was short and decisive in our timeline. The US swiftly defeated Spain, taking control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. It marked the birth of American imperialism and set the stage for the country's rise as a global power. But what if that war had ended differently? What if Spain, though bruised and in decline, managed to fend off the American onslaught? What if the mighty American Navy suffered a devastating defeat at Santiago de Cuba? What if Filipino revolutionaries had turned against their American liberators before the Treaty of Paris was ever signed? Let's rewind history and alter just a few key moments. Let's imagine America losing its war against Spain, and what that means for the world we live in today. It starts in the Caribbean. The U.S. Navy, led by Admiral Sampson, expects an easy victory over the Spanish Atlantic Fleet. But this time, Spanish Admiral Pascual Cervera doesn't sail into a trap. His ships remain hidden in Santiago Harbor, reinforced by coastal artillery and a better understanding of the terrain. Meanwhile, American troops land in Cuba, expecting a quick and decisive engagement. Instead, they find themselves bogged down by disease, lack of supplies, and fierce resistance, not just from Spanish troops, but Cuban irregulars loyal to Madrid. Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders charge up San Juan Hill, but this time, they're repelled. Roosevelt is badly wounded. The American public, fed on stories of easy triumphs, is stunned as casualty lists grow and victories remain elusive. Then, in a shocking turn of events, the U.S. Atlantic Fleet suffers a crippling loss at sea. The Battle of Santiago Bay ends not in an American rout of the Spanish fleet, but with American ships scuttled or burning, thanks to hidden torpedo nets, tropical mines, and an unexpected alliance. Because in this version of history, Spain has been quietly preparing. It negotiates with Germany and gets token support, perhaps even a few advisors or submarines from the Kaiser. It's not enough to win a global war, but enough to tip the balance in Cuba and the Philippines. American attempts to land in Puerto Rico fail, and when troops finally reach the Philippines, they discover a revolution already underway, one that wants neither Spanish nor American control. The Treaty of Paris never materializes. A stunned United States is forced to sue for peace, accepting a humiliating settlement. Spain retains most of its colonial holdings. Cuba remains under Spanish control, perhaps with limited reforms to quell rebellion. The Philippines avoids decades of bloodshed under American occupation, but instead faces continued imperial rule under Spain, or perhaps a Spanish-backed monarchy. Puerto Rico never becomes a U.S. territory. Guam remains a strategic outpost for Madrid. The U.S. Navy is in shambles. American prestige is tarnished. This single loss has a profound ripple effect. Internally, the U.S. faces a crisis of identity. The idea of manifest destiny suffers a fatal blow. The country becomes more isolationist, licking its wounds. imperial dreams fade, at least for a generation. Teddy Roosevelt, a war hero in our world, becomes a political casualty in this one. His political rise stalls. There is no Roosevelt presidency, no progressive era under his watch. Conservation, trust-busting, and national parks are left to languish. The presidency falls to more conservative, business-aligned figures who steer the U.S. further into domestic industrial exploitation and away from reform. Without a colonial empire, the U.S. never becomes a Pacific power. There is no American presence in the Philippines. There's no forward base to project power into Asia. This means the American role in East Asia is significantly diminished. Japan, which watched America's imperial expansion with caution, now finds a power vacuum. Emboldened by America's failure, Japan steps more aggressively into the Pacific, expanding its own imperial ambitions. Korea and Manchuria fall under its control sooner. Without American competition, Japanese militarism festers and expands unchecked. Meanwhile, the Philippines becomes a battleground of its own. Spain's hold weakens over time, and revolutionary movements continue. But without U.S. intervention, the conflict becomes a long, drawn-out insurgency. There's no Philippine-American war, but instead, a brutal Spanish counterinsurgency. Civilian casualties rise. Famine and disease plague the islands. A generation grows up under bloodshed. Eventually, perhaps, Spain's grip weakens enough for a regional power, Japan or even Germany, to step in. In Latin America, the consequences are just as grim. Without the precedent of victory in 1898, the United States does not embark on its big stick diplomacy. There's no Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. U.S. influence in the Caribbean and Central America diminishes. European powers, especially Germany, take greater interest in the region. The Panama Canal, it might never be built by the U.S. Without control over the isthmus, American naval mobility is severely hampered. Instead, perhaps a Franco-German consortium builds the canal, establishing European dominance over Atlantic-Pacific trade routes. And then there's Cuba. In our world, Cuba becomes a U.S. protectorate, then an independent republic heavily influenced by American business and politics. In this alternate timeline, Cuba remains a Spanish possession, or worse, becomes a pawn between imperial powers. Its independence is delayed for decades. The Cuban identity that develops is less nationalist and more fractured. Future revolutions become bloodier, less ideological, and more desperate. The 20th century unfolds without the U.S. as a colonial power. This dramatically reshapes the lead-up to World War I. In our reality, the U.S. played a minor but decisive role in the Great War. In this world, a humiliated and isolated America lacks the will and infrastructure to get involved. There are no overseas bases, no strategic partnerships, no taste for foreign entanglements. Europe tears itself apart from 1914 to 1918, and the war drags on longer without American intervention. The death toll climbs. Entire generations are lost. The Treaty of Versailles, if it comes, is even more punitive. Without Wilson at the table pushing for a League of Nations, the post-war order is dictated entirely by Britain and France. German resentment festers even more deeply. Without American loans and aid, the post-war recovery falters. Hyperinflation becomes even more catastrophic. Communism gains traction, not just in Russia, but in Germany, Italy, even France. The world lurches toward a darker, more radicalized future. Let's talk about the long-term consequences for democracy. The U.S., having suffered a humiliating loss and retreated into isolationism, sees a decline in global influence. The American century never materializes. There's no soft power projected through media, culture, and democratic ideals. Instead, the 20th century becomes the stage for a battle between radical ideologies, fascism, communism, and imperialism, all unchecked by American power. World War II, if it happens, is very different. Perhaps it's a three-way war: imperial Japan, fascist Europe, and communist Russia, each fighting for dominance. Perhaps there is no Normandy, no Marshall Plan, no NATO. The post-war order is dictated not by a democratic superpower, but by authoritarian regimes, carving the world into spheres of influence. In this future, nuclear weapons may still be developed, but likely not by the United States. Perhaps Germany, with its advanced science and desperate ambition, gets there first. Or maybe Japan, controlling much of Asia and flush with resources, beats everyone to the punch. Either way, the moral calculus of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is replaced by something even colder: thermonuclear war, used not to end a world war, but to begin one. And back at home, America is a very different place. The lack of imperial success means fewer economic booms tied to overseas resources and markets. The Gilded Age drags on. There's no influx of wealth from colonies, no military-industrial complex to spur innovation. Urban poverty worsens. Labor movements grow angrier, more desperate. Without Roosevelt to mediate, strikes become violent. The American dream becomes increasingly elusive. Civil rights are also impacted. Black soldiers who fought in the Spanish-American War in our timeline used their service as leverage for rights and recognition. Without the war, and without overseas posts, African-American soldiers remain largely sidelined. The military stays more segregated. The long, slow fight for civil rights loses another spark. The same goes for women. The Spanish-American War accelerated discussions about women's roles, particularly in medicine and logistics. Without it, the suffrage movement slows. Perhaps women don't gain the right to vote until decades later. Social reform is delayed. The fabric of American society remains more conservative, more hierarchical. The ripple effects touch every corner of the modern world. No US victory means no global dominance of English-language media. Hollywood, as we know it, may never rise. Instead, global cinema is shaped by France, Germany, or Japan. American music, literature, and television remain niche rather than universal. The cultural homogenization of the late 20th century never occurs. Globalization is slower, more fractured, more tribal. Even the internet is different. Without American tech dominance, innovation clusters in Berlin, Tokyo, or Paris. Silicon Valley never becomes the beating heart of a digital revolution. The software you're using to watch this video, it might have been coded in Mandarin, German, or Japanese. Perhaps most hauntingly, in this world, the US never learns how to be a superpower. Its loss in 1898 becomes a national trauma, breeding paranoia, bitterness, and nationalism. When crisis after crisis unfolds abroad, whether in Europe, Asia, or Latin America, America watches, but does nothing, and the world burns. Empires rise again in the 21st century. China's ascent is unchecked. Europe remains a patchwork of aging powers and right-wing movements. The Middle East is reshaped not by US interventions, but by decades of colonial backlash and foreign wars. Genocides go unanswered. Climate action comes too late. The rules-based international order never coalesces. All because, over a century ago, one war ended differently. So next time you hear about the Spanish-American War, don't think of it as a dusty footnote. Think of it as the hinge on which the modern world turned. In our reality, it launched America onto the world stage. In this alternate one, it buried the country's global ambitions before they even began. History is full of what-ifs. This one is darker than most. But it reminds us how fragile power is, how quickly fortunes change, and how sometimes a single battle can rewrite the destiny of nations. If you enjoyed this deep dive into alternate history, don't forget to subscribe for more thought-provoking timelines. The world could have been very different, and we're just getting started.